The entire pack stood frozen beneath the cold glow of the moon, their voices swallowed by a silence so heavy it pressed against the chest like a storm waiting to break. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Every gaze was fixed on the center of the clearing, where power and fate collided in a moment that would not be forgotten. At the front stood Alpha Denzel. Unshaken, unyielding. His presence alone commanded obedience, the kind that had been forged through dominance, strength, and years of unquestioned authority. His shoulders were squared, his expression carved from stone, his voice already carrying the weight of a decision that would ripple through every life in the pack. And across from him stood Fiona. She did not look like someone who belonged in that moment, not in the eyes of the crowd, not in the quiet judgment that lingered in the air. Her hands trembled at her sides, though she fought to still them. Her breathing was uneven, caught somewhere between hope and dread, as if her heart refused to accept what her instincts were already screaming. The bond had led her here. The sacred pull that no wolf could deny. The connection whispered about in reverence. The promise that, when found, could never be broken without consequence. And yet, something felt wrong. The way the Alpha looked at her held no recognition, no warmth, no trace of the fierce protectiveness that should have burned in his chest. Instead, there was distance, calculation, a cold detachment that spread like frost across the clearing. The crowd began to shift, restless and uncertain. Low murmurs rippled outward, carried by disbelief and curiosity. This was not how it was supposed to happen, not when the bond revealed itself, not when fate made its choice known. A Luna was meant to be honored. Chosen. Claimed. But the Alpha did not step forward to claim her. He took a single step back. The movement was small, almost insignificant, yet it shattered something invisible between them. A quiet fracture that only she seemed to feel at first, her expression faltering as confusion tightened its grip. Then his voice cut through the silence. Calm, controlled, final. Words that did not rise in anger, yet struck harder than any shout ever could. He spoke of weakness, of expectations unmet, of a future that did not include her standing beside him. Each sentence fell like a blade, precise and merciless, leaving no room for misunderstanding. There was no hesitation in his tone, no flicker of doubt in his gaze, only a certainty that turned the moment into something far more brutal than rejection. It became judgment. And the pack watched. Some were shocked, others with quiet approval. A few with something darker, satisfaction curling beneath their stillness as though they had always believed she did not belong among them. Her lips parted as if to speak, as if to question what was happening, but the words never came. Whatever she had hoped for dissolved under the weight of his declaration, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than anything she could have said. The bond strained. It pulled. It resisted. For a brief, fragile second, it seemed as though something unseen might intervene, as though fate itself might correct the course that had gone so terribly wrong. But the Alpha did not waver. He did not look away. And when he spoke again, there was no mistaking what came next. The rejection. Not whispered, not softened, not hidden behind tradition or ceremony. Given freely, openly, in front of every wolf who would remember it for the rest of their lives. The air shifted. A pressure snapped. Something ancient and sacred fractured with a force that could not be seen, yet was felt by all who stood close enough to witness it. Her body stiffened as the impact tore through her, not visible to the eye, yet undeniable in the way her breath caught and her knees nearly gave out beneath her. Still, she did not fall. Not completely. She remained standing, held upright by something deeper than pride, something that refused to let her collapse in front of those who were already watching too closely, waiting to see what she would do next. The Alpha's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, not with regret, not with hesitation, but with the quiet finality of a decision already sealed. And then he turned away. Just like that. As though what had just happened carried no weight at all. As though she had never mattered. The clearing erupted into whispers once more, the silence breaking into fragments of speculation, disbelief, and quiet cruelty. Eyes followed her, measuring her reaction, searching for weakness, for tears, for anything that would confirm what they had just witnessed. But what they saw instead was something they did not expect. Because beneath the pain, beneath the shock that threatened to consume her, something else stirred. Faint, unfamiliar, unseen by most. A shift in the air that passed through the crowd without understanding, brushing against instincts that did not yet recognize what stood before them. And somewhere at the edge of the gathering, one of the elders stilled. His expression changed, just slightly, as his gaze sharpened with a realization that came too late to stop what had already been done. Because the moment the Alpha turned his back was the moment everything began to change. And by the end of this story, he will beg for her forgiveness. But she may never give it. The moment should have ended when he turned away, when the bond shattered and the silence cracked into whispers. But it didn't. It lingered, stretched thin across the clearing like a wound left open, refusing to close, refusing to let anyone forget what had just happened. Because he wasn't finished. The Alpha slowed his steps, then stopped. A quiet shift rippled through the pack as he turned back around, his presence once again pulling every eye toward him. There was no urgency in his movement, no flicker of uncertainty, only a deliberate calm that made what followed feel even more cruel. He had already rejected her. Yet he chose to speak again. His gaze settled on her, not with curiosity, not with conflict, but with a sharp, assessing edge, as though he were examining something that had failed to meet expectation. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the clearing, steady and unchallenged. He did not raise it. He did not need to. She is weak. The words landed without hesitation, cutting through the murmurs that had begun to rise. A few wolves shifted uncomfortably, though none dared to interrupt. Others leaned in, drawn by the spectacle unfolding before them. His eyes never left her. There is no strength in her blood, no presence worthy of standing beside me, no sign that she could lead, command, or endure what it means to be Luna. Each sentence came measured, deliberate, stripped of emotion, yet heavy with judgment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was dismissal. And that made it worse. The girl at the center of it all felt the weight of every word settle against her skin, sinking deeper with each passing second. Her pulse thundered in her ears, so loud it almost drowned out his voice, yet she heard every syllable with unbearable clarity. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, nails pressing into her palms as if grounding herself against the invisible force threatening to pull her apart. She tried to steady her breathing, but it betrayed her, catching unevenly, rising too fast, too shallow, refusing to obey. Still, she did not speak. Not because she had nothing to say, but because something inside her understood that words would not matter here. Not to him. Not to them. A soft laugh broke through the tension, light and deliberate, drawing attention to the side of the clearing where she stood. The rival. She had been watching from the beginning, poised and composed, her posture effortless, her expression untouched by the discomfort that lingered among the others. Now, she stepped forward just enough to be seen more clearly, the faint curve of satisfaction resting on her lips. Her gaze flicked toward the girl, slow and knowing, before returning to the Alpha as if this outcome had always belonged to her. She was never meant for this, the rival said, her tone smooth, almost gentle, though the meaning beneath it carried no kindness. You can feel it. Anyone can. A few voices in the crowd murmured in agreement. Not loudly. Not boldly. But enough. Enough for it to spread. Enough for it to take root. The girl's chest tightened as those whispers brushed against her, each one adding to the pressure already building within her. It wasn't just his rejection anymore. It was becoming something larger, something collective, as if the entire pack was slowly deciding her worth in real time. Her heartbeat grew faster, each pulse striking harder than the last, echoing through her body with a force that made her vision blur at the edges. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, though she remained standing, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fall. The alpha took another step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel even more suffocating. "You do not belong here," he continued, his voice quieter now, though no less sharp. "This pack requires strength. It demands resilience. It demands a Luna who can stand beside an alpha, not someone who would break under the weight of that responsibility." His words settled over her like chains. Heavy, restricting, final. Something inside her chest twisted, not just from the pain of what he was saying, but from the deeper realization that he believed every word. There was no hesitation in him, no struggle between instinct and choice. He had made his decision, and he stood by it without question. That was what hurt the most. Not the rejection itself, but the certainty behind it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the crowd caught the attention of a few, though most remained focused on the unfolding scene. The elders stood together, their expressions harder to read now, their earlier composure beginning to fracture beneath something unspoken. One of them leaned slightly toward another, his voice low, barely audible. Yet the tension in his posture spoke louder than words. The girl swayed, just slightly, her balance faltering for a fraction of a second before she steadied herself again. Her hands trembled despite her effort to control them, the reaction slipping through her defenses no matter how tightly she held on. She drew in a breath, deeper this time, forcing her lungs to expand, forcing her body to remain upright. The alpha watched her with the same unchanging expression, as though waiting for something, though what that was remained unclear. Perhaps he expected her to protest, to beg, to argue against what had already been decided. But she did none of those things. Instead, she lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze. And for a brief moment, something passed between them. Something quiet. Something almost imperceptible. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a submission. It was something else entirely. Something that did not fit the image he had already placed upon her. And that was when it happened. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But undeniably. A subtle shift in the air, like a breath drawn by something unseen. A faint, unfamiliar sensation that brushed against the instincts of those closest to her, causing a few to stiffen without understanding why. The elders exchanged another look, sharper this time. The rival's expression faltered for the smallest fraction of a second, her confidence wavering just enough to go unnoticed by most. And the alpha paused, only for a heartbeat, only for the briefest moment, but long enough for something to register beneath the surface. Something that did not align with everything he had just said. The girl felt it too. That strange, fleeting sensation rising from somewhere deep within her, something that did not belong to fear or pain, something that did not match the weakness they saw when they looked at her. It flickered, then faded, leaving behind a question that lingered in the space between them. Because despite everything that had just been declared, despite the certainty in his voice and the judgment in their eyes, something felt off. The shift in the air should have meant something. It should have slowed him down, forced a second look, carved even the smallest crack into the certainty that held him so firmly in place. But it didn't. Whatever flicker of hesitation touched him vanished just as quickly as it came, buried beneath pride, expectation, and the unshakable belief that he was right. The moment passed, and with it, the last fragile chance for this to end differently. She felt it slip away. That quiet, almost invisible possibility that someone might stop this, that something might intervene before the damage became irreversible. It dissolved like mist under the weight of his presence, leaving her standing alone at the center of a choice she never wanted to face. Still she tried. Her lips parted, her voice trembling as it struggled to rise past the tightness in her throat. There were words inside her, questions, fragments of disbelief that demanded to be heard, but they tangled together, caught between fear and desperation. Alpha I. She never finished. His hand lifted, not in anger, not in haste, but with a simple, controlled motion that silenced her more effectively than any shout could have. The gesture alone carried authority, final and unquestionable, cutting through her attempt as though it had never mattered. The interruption was quiet. The effect was not. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle yet sharp, as the weight of what was about to happen settled over them. Conversations died, breathing slowed. Even the restless shifting from before stilled into something heavier, something expectant. Because this was no longer just rejection. This was ritual. The alpha stepped forward again, closing the distance between them with measured steps that echoed too loudly in her ears. Every instinct she had screamed at her to move, to step back, to create space between herself and what was coming, yet her body refused to obey. It held her there, locked in place. As if fate itself demanded, she faced this moment without escape. When he spoke, his voice carried a different tone now, one that reached deeper than before, threading through the air with a force that pressed against every wolf present. I, as alpha of this pack, he began, each word deliberate, binding, reject the bond that ties me to you. The world seemed to tilt. For a single, fragile second, nothing existed beyond those words. Not the crowd. Not the forest. Not even the ground beneath her feet. Only the bond. That invisible thread that had drawn her to him, that had whispered promises she never asked for, that had settled into her soul with a quiet certainty she could not explain. And now it was being torn away. At first there was silence. A hollow pause, like the breath before a storm breaks. Then the pain came. It didn't strike all at once. It built. Slow. Relentless. Starting deep within her chest, where the bond had taken root, twisting tighter and tighter until it felt as though something inside her was being pulled apart from the inside out. Her breath hitched sharply, her body reacting before her mind could even understand what was happening. Her hand flew to her chest, fingers pressing against the place where the ache burned the strongest, as though she could hold it together, as though she could stop whatever was unraveling within her. But she couldn't. The force surged, spreading through her veins like fire, hot and consuming, stealing the strength from her limbs, bending her slightly forward as she struggled to remain standing. A sound escaped her then. Not quite a cry. Not quite a gasp. Something in between. Raw. Uncontrolled. The crowd felt it. Some flinched. Others turned away, unable or unwilling to watch the full extent of what rejection truly did. A few remained still, their expressions hardened, as if witnessing her pain confirmed everything they already believed about her. But the elders, they did not look away. Their focus sharpened, their stillness carrying a different kind of tension now, one that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with something they did not yet understand. The alpha remained unmoved. His expression did not shift, his stance did not falter, even as the bond snapped fully into place. Because that was the moment it happened. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once. A sharp, invisible fracture tore through the connection between them, severing what had once been whole. The force of it hit her like a wave, crashing through her chest with a finality that left no room for doubt. It was over. Completely. Irrevocably. The pain peaked, stealing the air from her lungs as her knees weakened beneath her. For a second, it seemed as though she might fall, as though her body would finally give in to the weight of everything crashing down on her. But somehow, she held on. Barely. Her breathing came in uneven bursts, her vision swimming as the world struggled to steady itself around her. The space where the bond had been felt wrong now, empty in a way that was almost worse than the pain itself. Like something essential had been taken, leaving behind a hollow she could not fill. And through it all, he watched. Silent. unyielding, as if none of it touched him. That realization cut deeper than anything else. Not the rejection, not the words, but the absence of any trace that this mattered to him at all. Slowly, she lifted her head again, her gaze finding his despite everything urging her to look away. There was no strength in that movement, no defiance meant to challenge him, only a quiet need to understand what she had done to deserve this. But there was no answer waiting for her there. Only distance. Only finality. Only the undeniable truth that whatever had connected them was gone, and he had been the one to destroy it. The clearing remained still, suspended in the aftermath of what had just occurred. No one spoke. No one moved. Every wolf present understood that they had just witnessed something sacred being broken, something that should never have been treated so lightly. And yet it had been. She swallowed, the motion slow, painful, as if even that simple act required more strength than she had left. Words lingered at the edge of her mind again, fragile and uncertain, but this time she did not try to speak them. Because there was nothing left to say. Only a choice. Stay. Or leave. Fight for something that had already been taken from her. Or walk away from a place that had never truly accepted her. The question lingered, not just within her, but within everyone watching, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. And now it turns to you. What would you do in her place? Fight or walk away? No one expected her to walk away. Not like that. Not after everything that had just been taken from her. Not after the bond had been severed in front of the entire pack. Not after the kind of pain that usually left wolves broken on the ground, unable to stand, unable to breathe, unable to gather themselves into anything resembling composure. Yet she moved. Slowly at first, as though testing whether her body would obey her, as though each step required permission from something deeper than muscle or bone. Her balance wavered for a moment, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed, but she steadied herself before anyone could mistake it for weakness. And then she kept going. One step, then another. Each movement carried her further from the center of the clearing, further from the alpha, further from the place where everything had unraveled. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path without being asked, without being told, as though something about her presence still demanded space even now. No one reached out. No one stopped her. They simply watched. Some with pity. Some with quiet judgment. Some with expressions that revealed nothing at all. But beneath those surface reactions, something else stirred, something that did not yet have a name, something that passed between them like a current they could not quite feel, yet could not ignore either. Her breathing remained uneven, though she forced it into rhythm, drawing each breath deeper than the last, refusing to let the emptiness in her chest consume her completely. The absence of the bond lingered like a phantom ache, a hollow space where something vital had once lived. It should have left her weaker. It should have stripped her down to nothing. And yet, with every step she took away from him, something shifted. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. At the edge of the clearing, the elders stood together, their presence quieter than the rest, yet far more significant. They had not spoken during the rejection, had not intervened, had not challenged the alpha's decision in front of the pack. But now, they were watching her closely. Too closely. One of them leaned slightly forward, his gaze narrowing as she passed within range, as though he were trying to catch something just out of reach, something that brushed against his senses without fully revealing itself. Another elder inhaled slowly, deeper than necessary, his expression tightening as the air carried something unfamiliar toward him. It wasn't strong. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. A faint trace hidden beneath everything else. Something that did not belong. The first elder's fingers curled slightly at his side, his posture stiffening as realization flickered across his features, quick and sharp before he could fully contain it. He turned his head, just enough to meet the eyes of the elder beside him. And in that brief exchange, understanding passed between them. Not complete, not certain, but enough to disturb the stillness they had maintained until now. Their silence, once composed, began to fracture. A third elder shifted, his attention snapping toward the girl as she moved farther away, his instincts pulling him in a direction he did not yet understand. Because what they were sensing should not have been possible. Not here. Not now. Not after what had just been done. The girl did not look back. She did not hesitate. She did not slow her pace as the distance between her and the pack grew, as though leaving was the only thing holding her together, as though stopping would mean collapsing under the weight of everything she refused to show. But the air around her was changing. It began as a faint disturbance, something so slight that most dismissed it as nothing more than imagination, a trick of heightened emotion lingering after the intensity of the moment. A shift in pressure, a subtle pull, the kind that brushed against the instincts of wolves without fully registering as a threat. Then it deepened, just slightly, enough for those closest to feel it, enough for the elders to recognize that what they had sensed before was not a mistake. The first elder took a step forward, his composure slipping just enough to reveal urgency beneath it. His gaze remained fixed on her, tracking her movement as though losing sight of her would mean losing something far more important. He inhaled again, this time sharper, this time searching. And then he froze. The realization struck him all at once, not gradually, not with hesitation, but with a clarity that sent a visible tension through his entire frame. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Low, unsteady, carrying a weight that did not belong to doubt, but to something far more dangerous. That scent. The elder beside him stiffened, his eyes widening as the same understanding began to take shape within him, slower, but no less certain. It can't be. The words lingered between them, fragile yet heavy, as though speaking them too loudly might make them real in a way they were not prepared to face. Around them, the rest of the pack remained unaware, still caught in the aftermath of the rejection, still focused on the humiliation, the broken bond, the alpha who stood at the center of it all. They did not see what the elders saw. They did not feel what had begun to awaken. But it was there, growing, quiet, unfolding beneath the surface of everything they thought they understood. The girl reached the edge of the clearing, her steps slowing just slightly as she crossed the invisible boundary between what had been and what was yet to come. For a brief moment, the air around her stilled completely, as though holding its breath, as though waiting. Then the disturbance pulsed. Once, faint but undeniable. A ripple that spread outward, brushing against the senses of every wolf present, too quick to grasp, too subtle to explain, yet strong enough to leave behind a lingering unease. The elders felt it most. Their expressions hardened, their earlier restraint breaking beneath the weight of what that single pulse confirmed. Because it wasn't weakness they had sensed. It wasn't emptiness left behind by a broken bond. It was something else entirely. Something rare. Something ancient. Something that should have been recognized before this moment ever had the chance to unfold. The first elder's jaw tightened as he watched her disappear beyond the clearing, his thoughts racing ahead of him, piecing together fragments that no longer felt disconnected. The rejection, the resistance, the shift in the air, the scent, all of it leading to a conclusion that settled heavily in his chest. A conclusion that came too late to change what had already been done. Behind him, the alpha remained unaware, still standing where he had made his decision, still untouched by the realization creeping through the elders like a rising storm. But that would not last. Because truth, once uncovered, does not stay hidden for long. And when it surfaced, it would not come quietly. The elder exhaled slowly, his voice dropping even lower, as though speaking the thought aloud might carry consequences of its own. They realized something. His gaze lingered on the place where she had vanished, his expression tightening with the weight of what could no longer be undone. Too late. She should have collapsed the moment she crossed the boundary. Every instinct shaped by pack life demanded it. Rejection was not only emotional, it was physical, spiritual, something that hollowed a wolf from the inside and left nothing behind but fragments that struggled to exist on their own. Most never made it far after something like that. Most never found the strength to keep walking. But she did. Step after step, she moved beyond the edge of the territory, past the invisible line that separated belonging from exile. The sounds of the pack faded behind her, swallowed by the quiet of the forest, until even the echoes of what had just happened could no longer reach her. Still, the silence did not bring peace. It pressed in around her, thick and unrelenting, leaving her alone with the weight of everything she refused to show. Her breathing grew uneven again, sharper now, as though her body was only just catching up to the damage that had been done. The bond was gone. Completely. And the space it left behind felt wrong in a way she could not describe. Her hand lifted slowly to her chest, fingers pressing against the hollow ache that lingered there. It wasn't the same burning pain as before. That had passed. This was different. Quieter. Deeper. A constant reminder that something essential had been taken, something she had never even been given the chance to understand. Her steps faltered for a moment, the ground beneath her seeming less stable than before, but she forced herself forward again. Stopping was not an option. Not here. Not now. Because there had never been a place for her there. Not truly. The thought came uninvited, yet it did not feel new. It carried a familiarity that settled into her mind with uncomfortable ease, as though it had been waiting beneath the surface for far longer than she realized. And with it, memories began to rise. Not all at once. Not clearly. But enough. Fragments slipping through the cracks in her control, pulling her backward into moments she had long tried to ignore. Voices first. Soft at the edges, distorted by time, yet unmistakable in their meaning. She's different. There's something wrong with her. She doesn't feel like one of us. The forest blurred around her as those words echoed through her mind, overlapping with images that followed close behind. Children standing apart from her. Circles that never opened. Games she was never invited to join. Small, quiet exclusions that built over time into something much larger, something that shaped the way others looked at her long before she understood why. Her pace slowed without her realizing it, her focus shifting inward as the past pressed closer. A younger version of herself stood at the edge of a training ground, watching as the others practiced under the supervision of warriors who barely spared her a glance. When she tried to step forward to join them, the response had always been the same. A shake of the head. A dismissive gesture. An unspoken message that said she did not belong there. Even then, she had felt it. That distance. That separation. As though there was an invisible line drawn around her that no one else was willing to cross. Her jaw tightened slightly as the memory shifted again, pulling her deeper. This time, it was colder. Night. The air sharper, heavier with something unspoken. She stood alone near the edge of the pack grounds, much like she did now, her small frame wrapped in a thin layer of warmth that did little to protect her from the chill that seemed to settle into her bones. There had been fear then. Confusion. A quiet question that lingered in her mind, one she had never been given an answer to. Why? Why did everything feel different? Why did she feel different? The memory flickered, unstable, as though something within it resisted being seen clearly. And then, it cut. Not smoothly. Not gently. But abruptly. A sharp shift that pulled her into something else entirely. The forest around her faded into darkness, replaced by a space that felt smaller, more enclosed. A room, dimly lit, silent in a way that carried tension rather than peace. She was younger here, much younger, standing in the center of that room with wide eyes and unsteady breath, her small hands clenched tightly at her sides, as though bracing for something she did not understand. And then it happened. A faint glow. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft shimmer beneath her skin that flickered and vanished before it could fully take shape. But it came back, stronger this time, spreading across her wrist in a pattern that did not look natural, that did not resemble anything she had seen before. A mark, intricate, alive in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Her breath hitched as she stared at it, confusion giving way to something closer to fear as the light pulsed once, twice, growing brighter with each passing second. She did not know what it meant. She did not know what was happening. But she knew it wasn't normal. A sudden movement broke the stillness. Someone else in the room. Vast. Urgent. The glow vanished the moment they reached her, their hand closing around her wrist with a force that was not meant to hurt, yet carried a clear intention. To stop it. To hide it. No one can see this, the voice said, low and firm, leaving no room for argument. She looked up, confusion written across her face, searching for answers that did not come. Do you understand? The question lingered, heavy with something she could not yet grasp. Slowly, uncertainly, she nodded. And just like that, the moment ended. The memory fractured, slipping away before she could hold on to it, leaving behind only the echo of what she had seen and the unease that followed. The forest returned around her, the present settling back into place as her steps came to a stop. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just surfaced. That mark, that voice, the way it had been hidden. Her fingers curled slightly, her gaze dropping to her wrist as though expecting to see something there, something that would confirm what her memory had shown her. But there was nothing. No glow. No sign. Only skin that looked the same as it always had. Yet the feeling remained. That something had been taken from her. Not just the bond. Something older. Something buried. A truth she had never been allowed to understand. The wind shifted around her, brushing lightly against her skin, carrying with it a faint sensation that made her still completely. Not fear. Not pain. Something else. Something that felt familiar. Her head lifted slowly, her gaze moving through the trees ahead of her, as though searching for something she could not yet see. Because for the first time, she began to realize something that had always been there, hidden beneath everything she thought she knew. She had never truly belonged to that pack. Not because she was weak. Not because she was unworthy. But because she had never been meant to. They did not wait for certainty. Instinct moved them before proof could settle, before doubt could slow what urgency had already begun. The elders broke from the edge of the clearing with a quiet haste that did not match their usual composure, their steps measured, yet unmistakably driven by something deeper than curiosity. Because what they had felt, what they had sensed in that fleeting moment as she walked away, did not belong to coincidence. It belonged to something older. Something they had only ever spoken of in fragments, in guarded conversations, in warnings that were never meant to become reality. The forest seemed to close in behind them as they moved, the sounds of the pack fading into distance, while a different kind of silence took hold, heavier, more deliberate, as though the very air understood the weight of what they were about to confront. They did not speak at first. There was no need. Each of them carried the same thought, the same growing realization that pressed against the edges of reason, demanding to be acknowledged. They reached the council chamber hidden deep within the pack's territory, a place untouched by time, carved from stone and memory, where decisions were made and secrets were kept long after the rest of the world had forgotten them. The doors closed behind them with a low, echoing sound. Only then did the tension break. "You felt it," one of them said, his voice quieter than usual, though not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what he was admitting. Another nodded, his expression tight, controlled, yet unable to fully mask what lay beneath. "It wasn't weakness," he replied slowly. "It couldn't have been." A third elder moved toward the far wall, his steps more deliberate now, as though guided by something he had tried to ignore for far too long. His hand hovered for a moment over the surface, before pressing against a hidden mechanism, revealing a narrow passage behind it. The others exchanged a brief look. No one questioned it. They followed. The passage led deeper, into a space rarely accessed, a place reserved for knowledge that carried consequences simply by being remembered. The air within was colder, stiller, holding the faint scent of age, and something else, something that lingered just beyond recognition. At the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal. Ancient, worn by time. Upon it rested a sealed container, its surface marked with symbols that had not been used in generations, their meaning known only to those who had studied long enough to understand what they represented. The elder who had led them there paused before it, his hand resting lightly against the lid as hesitation flickered across his features. Not fear, but awareness. Because once this was opened, there would be no denying what they found inside. Another elder stepped forward, his voice lower now, edged with urgency. "If we are wrong, we lose nothing but time," he said. "But if we are right..." He did not finish. He did not need to. The implications settled heavily in the room, unspoken yet fully understood. The first elder exhaled slowly, then lifted the lid. A faint sound echoed as it shifted, the seal breaking after years of remaining untouched. Inside lay a bundle of aged parchment, its edges worn, its surface marked with writing that had faded but not disappeared. Carefully, almost reverently, he lifted it. The room seemed to still as the parchment was unrolled, the symbols stretching out beneath the dim light, revealing lines that had been preserved not for history, but for warning. For prophecy. Silence fell again. Not the kind that came from uncertainty, but the kind that followed recognition. One of the elders stepped closer, his gaze scanning the text with growing intensity, his breath slowing as the pieces began to align. "It speaks of a Luna," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, though it carried through the chamber with unmistakable clarity. Not chosen by strength alone, not bound by tradition, but born of a bloodline that predates the pacts themselves. Another elder leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he followed the lines, his expression shifting from doubt to something far more serious. "A rare lineage," he added, "one that cannot be created, cannot be forced, only revealed." The first elder's grip on the parchment tightened slightly as he continued reading, his voice steady, though the weight behind it grew with each word. "She will not rise through acceptance," he said. "She will not claim power through unity, but through separation." The room seemed to grow colder. The meaning began to settle. Slowly, relentlessly. A third elder spoke then, his tone sharper now, as realization struck him fully. "The rejection." He stopped, his gaze lifting from the parchment to meet the others, the truth reflected clearly in his eyes. It wasn't a mistake. No one answered immediately. Because they were already seeing it. Already understanding what had unfolded in the clearing not moments ago. The Alpha's decision. The bond breaking. The shift in the air. It had not been random. It had not been meaningless. It had been part of something far greater than any of them had considered. The first elder's voice dropped even lower as he reached the final line, the one that bound everything together with a clarity that left no room for denial. "She must be rejected before she can rise." The words lingered in the chamber, heavy and absolute, settling into the silence like a truth that had waited far too long to be spoken aloud. No one moved. No one looked away. Because now they knew. The girl who had just been cast aside, the one they had allowed to walk away without question, was not what they had believed her to be. She was not weak. She was not unworthy. She was something else entirely. Something they had failed to recognize until it was already beyond their control. One of the elders stepped back slowly, his expression darkening as the full weight of their realization settled over him. "If this is true," he began, his voice tighter now, edged with something dangerously close to urgency, "then we have already set it in motion." Another elder nodded, his gaze distant, as though seeing beyond the chamber, beyond the pack, to something far greater that was already beginning to unfold. "And we have no way of stopping it." The room fell silent once more. But this time, it was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of consequence. He was not meant to hear it. The chamber was sealed for a reason, hidden beneath layers of stone and silence, a place where truths too dangerous for the rest of the pack were kept buried. No alpha entered without summons. No outsider crossed its threshold without permission. Yet he stood there, just beyond the entrance, unseen, unannounced, and listening. At first, it had not been intentional. He had followed instinct rather than thought, drawn by the unusual movement of the elders, by the shift in their behavior that did not match the certainty he carried after the rejection. Something about the way they had looked at her, something restrained, something almost urgent, had stayed with him longer than it should have. It lingered. It pressed. And it led him here. Now, as the final words settled within the chamber, they reached him too, slipping through the narrow opening left behind, carrying a meaning that struck deeper than anything he had expected. She must be rejected before she can rise. The sentence did not echo. It did not need to. It embedded itself into his mind with a clarity that could not be dismissed, repeating once, then again, until it refused to be ignored. For a moment, he did not move. He did not react. He simply stood there, the weight of what he had just heard settling slowly, deliberately, as though his mind was trying to reshape it into something less dangerous, something that would allow him to walk away unchanged. But it did not change. It sharpened. And with it, everything else began to shift. The certainty that had carried him through the clearing, the unwavering belief that his decision had been necessary, began to fracture at the edges. It did not break all at once. It resisted, holding firm against the rising doubt, but the cracks were there now. Visible. Spreading. Unavoidable. His jaw tightened slightly as his thoughts turned, not outward, but inward, searching through the moments that had led to this point, pulling them apart, examining them in a way he had not allowed himself to before. Her scent. It came back first. Not as a vague memory, but with startling clarity, as though it had never truly left him. There had been something unusual about it from the beginning, something that did not align with anything he had encountered before. It had not been weak. It had not been ordinary. It had been different. Subtle enough to dismiss at the time, easy to overlook beneath expectation and assumption. Yet now, in the context of what he had just heard, it refused to remain insignificant. His breath slowed. His focus sharpened. And the next memory followed. Her strength. Not the kind displayed through dominance or aggression, not the kind that demanded attention or recognition, but something quieter, something that had revealed itself in moments he had chosen not to examine closely. The way she had remained standing. The way she had endured the bond, snapping, without collapsing completely. The way she had walked away. Alone. Unaided. Unbroken, in a way that did not match the image he had placed upon her. That memory did not sit well. It shifted something. Something that had once felt solid. And then came the final piece. Her resistance. It had been there from the beginning, though he had not named it as such. A subtle defiance, not in words, not in action, but in presence alone. She had not reacted the way others did under pressure, had not bent or yielded in the ways expected of someone in her position. There had been a quiet steadiness in her, a refusal to fully break. At the time, he had interpreted it as weakness disguised as composure. Nah. He was no longer certain. The silence within the chamber stretched, the elders still speaking, their voices lower now, discussing implications, consequences, possibilities that reached far beyond what had already been done. But he was no longer listening to them. Not entirely. Because the realization was forming elsewhere. Within him. Slowly. Relentlessly. The pieces aligned one by one, each memory fitting into place with a precision that left no room for dismissal. What he had seen, what he had felt, what he had chosen to ignore. All of it leading to a conclusion he had not considered before this moment. A conclusion that pressed against his thoughts with increasing force. His chest tightened slightly, the sensation unfamiliar, unwelcome, yet impossible to push aside. It was not fear, not yet, but it carried the beginnings of something that could become it. Doubt. Real doubt. The kind that did not fade easily, the kind that rooted itself deeply once allowed to take hold. He straightened slightly, his posture still controlled, still composed, yet something within it had shifted, something that could not be seen by those who did not know where to look. Because the Alpha did not doubt. The Alpha did not question. The Alpha decided. And yet, here he stood, questioning. The memory of her gaze surfaced then, unbidden, sharper than before. The way she had looked at him after the bond had broken. Not with anger, not with pleading, but with something quieter. Something that lingered now, in a way it had not in the moment. It unsettled him, more than it should have. His hand clenched slightly at his side, the movement small, controlled, yet revealing a tension that had not been there before. Inside the chamber, one of the elders spoke again, his tone edged with urgency. If she truly is what the prophecy describes, he said, then her power will not remain hidden for long. Another responded, his voice carrying a weight that matched the gravity of the situation. And when it rises, it will not be something we can contain. The words reached him. Fully this time. And with them, the final shift. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. Uncertainty deepened into something heavier. Something colder. The possibility that what he had done was not only wrong, but irreversible. His breath slowed further, each inhale measured, controlled, as though maintaining that control externally could contain what was beginning to unravel internally. But it did not, because for the first time since he had taken his place as Alpha, for the first time since he had made a decision that affected the entire pack, for the first time since he had stood in the clearing and rejected the one fate had chosen for him, he felt it, not as a fleeting thought, not as a passing concern, but as something real, something undeniable, something that settled into his chest with a weight he could not ignore. For the first time, the Alpha felt like he had made a mistake. She did not make it far. The forest swallowed her footsteps, the distant noise of the pack grounds fading into a hollow silence that pressed in from every side. Branches scraped against each other overhead, leaves trembling with a wind that had not been there moments before, as though something unseen had followed her beyond the borders she once called home. She kept moving anyway. Not because she had strength left, but because stopping felt worse. Each step came heavier than the last, her body struggling to keep pace with a mind that refused to slow down. The echo of his voice still lingered, sharp and cutting, repeating in fragments that refused to fade no matter how far she walked. Unworthy. Weak. Not Luna material. The words clung to her, dragging behind her like chains she could not break, tightening with every breath she took. Her chest rose unevenly, her heartbeat no longer steady but erratic, pounding against her ribs with a force that made it hard to think clearly. Something was wrong. Not just emotionally. Physically. Her hand lifted slightly, pressing against her chest as though she could steady the rhythm herself, but it only made the sensation more intense, more real. Heat began to spread beneath her skin, slow at first, then building, gathering in a way that did not feel natural. It did not feel like pain. Not entirely. It felt like pressure, like something trying to break through. She stumbled. The ground beneath her feet shifted unexpectedly, her balance faltering as her vision blurred at the edges. For a brief moment, the world tilted, shadows stretching unnaturally between the trees, twisting into shapes that did not belong. Then her knees hit the forest floor. Hard. The impact sent a shock through her body, but she barely reacted to it. Her focus had already turned inward, toward the growing intensity beneath her skin, toward the strange energy that had begun to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Faster now. Stronger. Uncontainable. Her fingers curled into the earth, gripping the soil as though it could anchor her, as though it could keep her grounded while everything inside her began to shift in ways she did not understand. A sharp breath escaped her lips. Then another. And then it surged. The force came without warning, rising from deep within her, crashing through her body like a wave that refused to be held back. Her back arched slightly, her muscles tightening as the sensation spread outward, reaching every part of her at once. It was too much. Too sudden. Too powerful. Her eyes squeezed shut instinctively, as though darkness could shield her from whatever was happening, but it only made the experience sharper, more vivid, more impossible to ignore. Because it wasn't just inside her anymore. It was around her. The air shifted. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. The forest reacted. Leaves trembled violently despite the absence of wind. Branches creaked under an invisible strain, and the faint sounds of distant wildlife fell into an unnatural silence, as though everything within range had sensed it at the same time. Something had awakened. And it was not small. Her breathing grew uneven, her body trembling against the ground as the energy continued to build, refusing to settle, refusing to fade. It gathered at a single point, deep within her, before spreading outward again in pulses that grew stronger with each passing second. Then, it found its mark. A sharp, searing sensation ignited just beneath her skin, low against her side, burning with an intensity that forced a sound from her lips before she could stop it. Her hand moved instinctively, pressing against the source, but the contact only made it worse. Because it was no longer hidden. The mark. It was no longer faint. No longer dormant. It burned. Bright. Alive. The glow began subtly beneath her fingers, a soft light that pulsed in time with her heartbeat, but it did not stay subtle for long. It spread, seeping through fabric, illuminating the space around her with a steady, undeniable radiance that grew stronger with every passing moment. She gasped, her body reacting to the shift with a mixture of shock and instinct, her fingers pulling back as though the light itself had become too intense to touch. And then her eyes opened. Not slowly, not cautiously, but suddenly. And when they did, they were no longer the same. The color had changed. What had once been familiar was now something else entirely. Something brighter, something sharper, something that caught the light in a way that made it impossible to look away. They glowed. Not faintly, not briefly, but with a steady intensity that matched the power rising within her. Her breathing slowed, not because the energy had faded, but because she was beginning to adjust to it, to feel it, to understand, even if only slightly, that what was happening was not random, not accidental, not something that could be dismissed or explained away. It was meant to happen. Her posture shifted subtly, her body no longer collapsing inward, but beginning to steady itself, to rise despite the exhaustion that still lingered at the edges. The trembling did not stop completely, but it changed, becoming less about weakness and more about control. Because the energy was no longer overwhelming her. She was beginning to hold it. The light from the mark pulsed once more, brighter than before, casting shadows against the surrounding trees that stretched farther than they should have, bending at angles that did not match the natural world. And with it, her aura shifted. It was not something that could be seen easily by ordinary eyes. But it was there, present, expanding. The air around her grew heavier, charged with something ancient, something that did not belong to the present moment, something that carried the weight of a history long forgotten by most. The forest did not move. It did not breathe. It simply waited, as though it recognized what stood within it, as though it understood something she did not. Her gaze lifted slowly, her glowing eyes focusing on nothing and everything at once, as if she were seeing beyond what was directly in front of her, beyond the trees, beyond the path she had taken to get here. Toward something else. Something waiting. And far away, beyond the forest, beyond the boundaries she had just crossed. Something stirred in response. Not gently. Not quietly. But with a force that mirrored her own. The awakening had begun. And it was not going to stop. She was not alone. The forest had gone too still, too quiet in a way that did not belong to nature, and the silence carried a presence that could not be mistaken for emptiness. It pressed against the edges of the moment, heavy and watchful, as though something had stepped into the space without disturbing a single leaf. And then, it revealed itself. Not with sound, not with movement, but with a shift in the air, so sudden, so absolute, that even the energy surrounding her seemed to hesitate. From the shadows between the trees, a figure emerged. Large, unmistakably powerful. Each step it took was slow, deliberate, controlled in a way that spoke of experience rather than hesitation. Moonlight filtered through the branches above, catching against dark fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, outlining a form built not just for strength, but for command. This was not an ordinary wolf. It did not carry itself like one. Its presence alone altered the space around it, bending the atmosphere with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself to be understood. And its eyes, they were fixed on her, unwavering, knowing. She did not move at first. Her body remained where it was, half risen from the ground, her glowing gaze locked onto the approaching figure as instinct warred with something deeper, something older, something that did not recognize this presence as a threat. But it was not familiarity either. It was something else. Something that made her breath slow instead of quicken, something that held her in place not with fear, but with anticipation she could not explain. The wolf stopped a few steps away, close enough to see clearly, far enough to remain untouchable. For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest remained suspended in that unnatural stillness, as though the world itself had paused to witness what came next. Then, the wolf shifted, not into a lesser form, not into something weaker, but into something different. The change was seamless, fluid in a way that spoke of mastery rather than effort, the powerful frame condensing, reshaping, until the figure that stood before her was no longer entirely wolf, yet not entirely human either. A presence balanced between both. And when he stepped forward, the ground seemed to acknowledge it. She felt it, not through sight, not through sound, but through the energy that surrounded them both, the same force that had awakened within her now responding to his presence as though it recognized him. As though it had been waiting. "You've taken longer than expected." His voice broke the silence, low and steady, carrying a weight that did not need to rise to command attention. It was not loud, yet it filled the space completely, leaving no room for anything else. Her brows drew together slightly, confusion cutting through the lingering intensity of her awakening. She tried to speak, tried to form a question, but the words did not come easily, because something about him made questions feel unnecessary, and answers inevitable. He studied her for a moment longer, his gaze moving not just across her face, but through her, as though he could see everything she had been, everything she was, and everything she had yet to become. There was no hesitation in his expression. No doubt. Only certainty. "You felt it, didn't you?" he continued, his tone unchanged, as though the answer was already known. The shift, the release. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, the faint glow of her mark still pulsing beneath her skin, responding not just to her, but to him. She swallowed, her voice finally finding its way through the confusion. "What is happening to me?" The question lingered between them, fragile and heavy at the same time. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took another step closer, closing the distance just enough for the air between them to tighten, for the energy to sharpen into something undeniable. "You already know," he said quietly. And something in her chest reacted. Not with rejection, but with recognition. Her breath caught slightly, her gaze flickering as fragments of memory. No, not memory, something deeper than that, began to surface, incomplete and disjointed, yet carrying a truth she could not fully grasp. He saw it. Of course he did. "You were never meant to live the life they gave you," he continued, his voice lowering slightly, not in secrecy, but in gravity. "You were never meant to belong to that pack, not as one of them." Her heart tightened at that, the words striking something raw, something that had always existed beneath the surface of her thoughts, but had never been given form until now. "Then what am I?" she asked, her voice steadier this time, though the question carried more weight than before. His gaze did not waver. "You are what they tried to hide." The forest seemed to shift at that, the stillness deepening, as though even the trees leaned closer to hear. "They knew what you were the moment you were born," he continued, each word deliberate, each one landing with precision. "They saw the mark, they felt the power, and they understood what it meant." Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with something sharper, something that cut through the confusion and reached toward clarity. "They feared you." The statement did not come as a shock. Not entirely. Because somewhere, deep within her, it made sense. "They couldn't destroy you," he added, his tone tightening slightly, just enough to reveal a thread of something beneath his control. "So they chose the only option they believed would work." Her breath slowed, her body still, her focus locked entirely on him now. "To suppress you." The word hung between them, heavy and undeniable. "They buried your truth beneath lies. They placed you where your power would remain dormant. They made you believe you were less, so you would never question what you truly are." Her mind raced, the pieces beginning to align, the fragments of her past shifting into something that finally resembled understanding. The isolation, the rejection, the feeling that she did not belong. It had never been accidental. It had been designed. "But suppression has limits," he continued, his gaze flickering briefly to the faint glow still pulsing beneath her skin. "And rejection." He paused, just for a moment, as though acknowledging the significance of what had already happened. Was the final key. Her chest tightened again, the memory of that moment flashing through her mind with renewed clarity. But this time, it did not carry the same weight of humiliation. This time, it felt like something else. Like a beginning. He took one final step closer, close enough now that there was no distance left to maintain, no barrier between them, no space for doubt to hide. "You are not what they said you were," he said, his voice steady, certain, unshaken. "And you are not what you believed yourself to be." Her glowing eyes held his, searching, questioning, needing something more than words to anchor everything he had just revealed. And then, he gave it. "You are the one they wrote about," he said, the weight of the truth settling fully into the space between them. The one they feared would rise. The air around them seemed to tighten, the energy responding to the declaration, as though it had been waiting for it to be spoken aloud. The Prophesied Luna. The words did not echo. They did not need to. Because this time, they did not just reach her. They awakened something far deeper. Something that had been waiting far longer than she realized. And now, it was no longer hidden. She did not recognize herself anymore. The girl who had staggered out of the pack grounds, broken by rejection and weighed down by years of silent dismissal, felt like a distant memory already fading into something unreal. The forest still stood around her, the same towering trees, the same shifting shadows, yet everything within her had changed so completely that even the air felt different against her skin. It was no longer heavy. It responded. Every breath she took seemed to pull something deeper into her lungs, something charged, something alive, as though the world itself had begun to acknowledge her presence in a way it never had before. And she felt it. Not as chaos, not as something uncontrollable, but as power waiting to be shaped. You're holding back. His voice cut through her focus, steady and observant, carrying no judgment, only truth. He stood several paces away now, arms relaxed at his sides, his posture effortless despite the undeniable authority that surrounded him. She turned toward him, her glowing eyes sharper than before, her awareness heightened in ways she was still trying to understand. "I'm trying not to lose control," she replied, her voice stronger now, though still edged with caution. A faint shift touched his expression, not quite approval, not quite amusement, but something in between. "You misunderstand," he said, stepping closer, his gaze locking onto hers with a precision that left no room for hesitation. "Control is not about restraint, it's about command." The words settled into her mind, reshaping the way she had been approaching the energy within her. Command. Not suppression. Not fear. She inhaled slowly, her posture straightening as she allowed herself to feel it again, not pushing it down this time, not trying to silence it, but letting it rise to the surface with intention. At first it was subtle, a faint hum beneath her skin, a quiet pulse that moved in rhythm with her heartbeat. But then, it responded. The energy surged upward, faster this time, stronger, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. It flowed through her like something that had finally been given permission to exist, spreading through every part of her with a clarity that made her breath catch. Her fingers twitched slightly, the air around them shifting in response, a faint distortion rippling outward as though the space itself had begun to bend around her. She felt it. Every movement. Every change. And for the first time, she did not pull back. "Good," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the intensity without disrupting it. "Now focus it." Her brows furrowed slightly, her concentration narrowing as she tried to grasp what he meant. The power within her was vast, layered in ways she could not fully map yet, but it was no longer overwhelming her. It was waiting for direction. Her gaze shifted to the ground in front of her, her attention locking onto a single point as she steadied her breathing, allowing the energy to gather rather than scatter. It resisted at first, not violently, but with a kind of wildness that had not yet been tamed. She exhaled slowly, adjusting, learning in real time, her instincts beginning to align with something deeper, something that did not come from thought, but from within. And then, it clicked. The energy stilled. Not completely, but enough. Enough for her to shape it. The air in front of her tightened, the faint distortion sharpening into something more defined, something visible even without the glow that had accompanied her earlier surge. A small shift. A controlled release. The ground reacted. Not with destruction, but with acknowledgement. A faint crack spread across the surface, subtle yet undeniable, tracing outward from the point she had focused on as though the earth itself had answered her call. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from realization. She had done that, not by accident, not by loss of control, but intentionally. "You see it now," he said, his voice lower, carrying a quiet certainty that matched the shift in her understanding. "It was never about whether you had power. It was about whether you could wield it." She straightened fully this time, her shoulders no longer weighed down, her stance no longer uncertain. The hesitation that had once defined her movements was gone, replaced by something steadier, something grounded. Confidence. Not forced, not borrowed, but earned in the span of moments that had changed everything. Her gaze lifted to meet his again, the glow in her eyes no longer just a reaction, but a presence, something that remained even as the surge settled into a controlled flow beneath her skin. "What else can I do?" she asked, her voice no longer questioning her worth but seeking her limits. A faint smile touched his expression, brief and restrained, but real. "More than you've been allowed to believe," he replied. He stepped back slightly, giving her space, his posture shifting just enough to signal what came next without needing to say it outright. "Show me." The challenge hung between them, not as a test of whether she could succeed, but as an invitation to step further into what she was becoming. She did not hesitate. Not this time. Her focus sharpened, her body aligning with the energy that now felt like an extension of herself rather than something separate. She moved forward, her steps steady, her presence different in a way that could not be ignored. The forest reacted again. Leaves stirred without wind. Branches creaked under an invisible pressure. The air thickened, charged with something that had not existed here before. And at the center of it was her, the girl who had once been dismissed, the one who had been called weak, unworthy, forgettable. She was none of those things now. The transformation was not just physical, not just power. It was identity. Reclaimed, redefined, unstoppable. And as the energy gathered once more, stronger this time, more controlled, more precise, it became clear that this was only the beginning. Because the one they had cast aside was no longer someone they could ever overlook again. She walked slowly at first, each step deliberate, measured, as if the earth beneath her had shifted in some secret agreement to hold her steady. The forest no longer felt like a refuge, no longer a place to hide from what had been stolen from her, because the girl who had entered it trembling and uncertain had ceased to exist. Every inch of her body radiated a presence that had never been hers before, yet had always been meant to emerge. Her shoulders lifted, squared with an authority that demanded recognition without a single word spoken. Her head was held high, eyes glowing faintly as the energy beneath her skin hummed in quiet rhythm, not chaotic, not desperate, but resolute, a pulse that resonated with the forest itself and echoed in the space around her like the first note of a song that no one could ignore. Each step she took carried weight, not in the sense of burden, but in the sense of inevitability. The ground seemed to acknowledge her as she moved, the faint cracks and bending of branches responding to the aura she now carried, bending the natural world into subtle submission without violence, without anger, but with a presence that could not be denied. Even the air seemed to shimmer, carrying a faint resonance that hinted at the power coursing through her in ways she had only begun to understand, yet already commanded. She had stopped being a girl defined by rejection. She had begun to embody the truth that had been hidden from her since birth, and the difference was visible in every movement, every breath, every flicker of her glowing eyes. The wind that brushed her face carried whispers she did not need to hear, whispers that spoke not of fear, not of doubt, but of acknowledgement, of recognition, of inevitability. She no longer flinched at her own energy, she guided it. Each breath drew power inward and released it outward, a controlled, steady stream that left no space for hesitation or question. Her aura had shifted from something subtle, latent, and misunderstood, into something commanding, almost magnetic, pulling the unseen toward her orbit, drawing the forest, the shadows, and the energy around her into alignment with her presence. And as she moved, the memory of the pack, of the rejection, of the humiliation, of the alpha's cruel words, lingered, not to weigh her down, but to sharpen her focus, to fuel the undeniable certainty in her stride. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum in the world around her, each step resonating with the promise that she was returning not to beg, not to plead, not to seek acceptance, but to reclaim what had been denied, to demonstrate what had been underestimated, to exist fully in a way that demanded recognition without compromise. Her posture spoke before her voice ever could. No longer uncertain, hesitant, or small, she stood as someone who understood the magnitude of what she carried within, who had felt the energy shift inside herself and bent it into shape, who had claimed mastery over what others had feared. The forest itself seemed to lean away subtly, acknowledging her emergence as the one who had been meant to rise from the shadows, the one whose presence had always been prophesied, even if the world had tried to ignore it. She was no longer the girl who had fled with trembling hands and a broken heart. Every movement now radiated control, elegance, and latent force, a quiet intensity that did not scream but resonated, leaving the world around her with the unmistakable knowledge that she was something far beyond ordinary. Her eyes swept across the distance ahead, glowing softly yet firmly, carrying the promise of inevitability and judgment, as if the pack, the alpha, the rivals, and even the elders could feel it in their bones without yet knowing what it meant. She paused for a moment, as if listening to the energy that responded to her in the forest. The subtle pull of power beneath her skin, the quiet surge of aura that made her feel almost untouchable, and with that pause, she realized the truth that had never been allowed to flourish before. The girl who had been humiliated, dismissed, and forgotten was gone. In her place stood someone shaped by awakening, tempered by energy, strengthened by rejection, and defined not by what others had said she could not be, but by what she had claimed herself to become. And with that understanding, she began to walk again, each step flowing seamlessly into the next, her stride unwavering, her presence undeniable. She was returning, not as the girl they had rejected, not as someone who would hide in the shadows, but as a force, a truth, a presence that demanded acknowledgement. The forest seemed to hum with her passage, the wind carrying the subtle echo of her power forward, announcing without a word that she had become something else entirely, something unstoppable, something inevitable, something that the world had yet to comprehend, but soon would. He couldn't find her. Not in the forest, not in the village, not in the spaces he had thought she might hide, not in the places he had expected her to linger out of shame, fear, or hesitation. Every familiar path led only to emptiness, every scent trail faded before it could guide him, and every instinct he relied on screamed in frustration at the realization that she had become something beyond the boundaries he had once believed he understood. The alpha, who had always commanded presence, respect, and fear in equal measure, now felt the unfamiliar tightening in his chest. The cold, hollow ache of uncertainty, the rising tremor of loss, the creeping awareness that what he had dismissed as weakness had transformed into something he could no longer control. His paws moved with purpose, cutting through the underbrush with silent precision, each step fueled by obsession that grew heavier with every passing heartbeat. The pack had noticed. The rival female who had waited for his attention, who had smiled at his glance and believed herself secure, now shrank beneath his glare, her presence suddenly meaningless, insignificant. He did not care for her approval. He did not care for her whispers or her sly insinuations. All he could feel, all he could think about, all that haunted him was her. The one he had rejected, the one he had cast aside publicly, the one whose absence had created a hollow he could neither fill nor ignore. He stopped suddenly, nose twitching, instincts straining. The faintest trace of her scent brushed against him in the wind, subtle yet unmistakable, and his heart clenched. Every memory of her rejection, of the bond he had severed so carelessly, surged back in a tidal wave of regret. Each word he had spoken to humiliate her, each sneer, each dismissal now replayed in cruel clarity against the shame that he refused to speak aloud, the shame that twisted within him like a living thing. And with that memory came a new, sharper edge, possessiveness he could not contain, the primal ache of wanting something he had forsaken, the raw, unrelenting pull of instinct that whispered in every corner of his mind that she belonged to him, whether she wanted it or not. His breaths came faster, shallow, uneven, as he moved again, faster this time, cutting across the terrain with a single-minded intensity, the forest blurring around him as his focus narrowed to the one thought he could not suppress. He had never felt powerless before. The pack had obeyed, rivals had cowered, threats had bent beneath his will without question. Yet now, for the first time in his life, he realized that there was someone whose presence, whose power, whose very being, defied him completely, and the realization shook him more profoundly than any physical strike, more deeply than any battle he had endured. He imagined her posture, the way she must walk now, the subtle shift in her aura, the undeniable authority she carried in each measured movement. His mind raced with images he had no right to dwell on, and yet could not suppress. The glow in her eyes, the way the energy seemed to flow from her as if the world itself recognized her ascent, haunted him with every step. She had risen from his rejection, not broken, not diminished, but transformed, and the thought ignited a fire he could neither quench nor ignore. He passed through familiar clearings, scanning the shadows, rejecting anything that even hinted at distraction. The rival female had tried again, stepping forward, expecting command, expecting his attention, but he barely registered her presence. He had no patience, no desire, no capacity for anything but the obsession that consumed him. His instincts no longer simply demanded dominance, they demanded her. And with each step, the fear grew, subtle at first, then rising, undeniable. Fear not for his safety, fear not for his pack, but fear of what he might lose if he did not find her soon, fear of what she might become without him, fear that he had underestimated the consequences of his own arrogance. Every tree, every shadow, every whisper of wind became a question mark, a potential clue, a promise of revelation. He moved faster, heart hammering, chest tight, breath ragged, the relentless rhythm of pursuit matching the relentless pounding of guilt and longing that drove him forward. The forest stretched endlessly, but he could not stop. He would not stop. Every instinct, every memory, every aching desire screamed that she was out there, that she had changed, and that he was no longer the alpha who determined fate, but a man chasing what he had foolishly let slip away. And in that obsession, in that fear, in that mounting realization of his own vulnerability, he glimpsed the truth he had ignored too long. He had rejected more than a mate, more than a bond, more than a possibility of control. He had rejected destiny itself. And now, with every step, every heartbeat, every ragged breath, he understood that the girl he had humiliated, the one he had cast aside, had not only escaped his authority. She had escaped the life he imagined for her, and in doing so, she had become something far greater than he had ever imagined, something he could neither contain nor command, yet could not bear to lose. He did not stop moving, and he did not allow himself a pause, because stopping meant surrendering to the dread, surrendering to the gnawing fear that she might slip beyond his reach entirely. And with each heartbeat, each step, each thought consumed by her, he understood more fully than ever that obsession had replaced certainty, that regret had replaced arrogance, and that fear, raw and unrelenting, had settled into the very core of him. He had lost control, and for the first time, he knew what it truly felt like to be powerless in the face of someone who had once been everything he thought he could command. Because she was no longer his to dismiss. She was no longer the girl he had rejected. And the knowledge alone was enough to drive him into a state of desperate, aching obsession that would neither waver nor fade until he found her. The moment her paws touched the familiar ground of the pack territory, the air shifted as though the world itself recognized a presence that demanded acknowledgement. It was not subtle. It was not tentative. The trees seemed to lean slightly, the wind stilled, and even the smallest rustle of leaves paused mid-motion, as if the forest collectively held its breath, anticipating the arrival of someone who no longer belonged to ordinary time or space. Every wolf within sight, from the youngest pup to the oldest elder, felt it before they understood it. The girl they had once dismissed, the mate the alpha had publicly rejected, was walking among them again, yet she was no longer the same. There was a radiance to her movement, a confidence that radiated like invisible fire, not aggressive, not vengeful, but so commanding that it created ripples across the very air, bending attention and instinct toward her as naturally as water flows downhill. She walked slowly, deliberately, her steps measured with precision and grace, each one carrying weight and purpose. Not one ounce of hesitation lingered in her stride, not one flicker of doubt clouded the glowing clarity of her eyes. The mark upon her wrist, once hidden and faint, pulsed gently with energy, casting a subtle light that mingled with the faint shimmer of her aura, something that could not be ignored or mistaken. Every muscle in her body seemed alive with controlled strength, every movement a signal of awareness and absolute command. Wolves instinctively shifted as she passed, some bowing without conscious thought, some lowering their heads as if honoring a presence older and wiser than themselves, even though none could explain why they reacted so completely. The silence that fell over the clearing was not the absence of sound, but a presence so intense it replaced it entirely. No whispers, no murmurs, no nervous shuffling, just her, walking through the territory as though she had always belonged and yet had returned as someone entirely other, someone elevated beyond the reach of ordinary judgment or comprehension. Even the rival female, who had once smirked at her misfortune, froze mid-step, realizing for the first time that all assumptions, all schemes, all positions of perceived dominance meant nothing in the presence of what had awakened. The energy emanating from her did not shout. It did not threaten. It simply existed, undeniable and inevitable, a force that made others shrink or bow without conscious command, a gravity so strong that defiance seemed absurd. The alpha, who had been searching desperately, felt it immediately, long before he glimpsed her form. His instincts screamed in recognition, claws of jealousy, fear, and desire tearing at his chest simultaneously. Every nerve he possessed, every sense finely tuned to dominance and territory, flared in response to the invisible pull she exerted on the world, on him, on the pack itself. She had returned not broken, not diminished, but whole, and the realization settled in his mind like ice melting slowly, painfully, against fire he could no longer control. And then, as if in confirmation of everything they had collectively felt but could not articulate, the wolves shifted instinctively. Not one thought of obedience prompted them. Not one alpha command issued from anyone's lips. Yet they bent on instinct alone, a quiet, reverent acknowledgement that the girl who had once been scorned had returned not as a supplicant, not as someone diminished, but as a presence that demanded recognition without question. She paused, allowing the air to settle, letting the subtle energy she exuded sink into every corner of the territory, filling every shadow and empty space. Her gaze swept across the pack, not searching, not accusatory, simply observing, cataloging, and asserting her place in a world that had so recently tried to deny it. There was no malice in her eyes, no need for vengeance, only an unshakable certainty, an authority born of struggle, awakening, and undeniable truth. Every wolf that met her gaze felt a shift within themselves, a recognition that she was no longer the girl who had run, who had cried, who had endured humiliation. She was elevated, transformed, a force of destiny walking among them as if the air itself had carved her from something more ancient than the pack's understanding. The alpha finally saw her from across the clearing. Time seemed to slow, as though the world had aligned around this single moment of reckoning. His chest tightened, his instincts warring between fear, longing, and the gnawing ache of regret. The presence that had been dismissed so carelessly now radiated command, and yet she had not spoken. She had not moved with aggression. She had simply returned, fully realized, and the impact reverberated through every spine, every paw, every heartbeat of the pack. No one told them to kneel. No one directed their bodies to bow in recognition. But instinct, respect, fear, and awe combined into something unavoidable, something primal, something that defied reasoning. And as she took another step, the quiet hum of power surrounding her seemed to announce a truth none could deny. The girl they had rejected was no longer theirs to underestimate, no longer bound by their judgments, no longer contained by what they had assumed she could be. She was not returning as the same girl. She was returning as something far greater, something undeniable, something that had been waiting all along for the moment to claim what was always hers. In the forest, the pack, the alpha himself, all of them felt it. Everything had changed. The clearing fell into an almost sacred silence, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath for the revelation that was about to unfold. The elders stepped forward, their expressions taut with a mixture of awe, fear, and reluctant respect, eyes fixed on her with the weight of generations pressing against their words. The air seemed charged, thick with unspoken energy, every leaf, every whisper of wind, every subtle tremor of the earth responding to the presence that had returned among them. They had watched countless pack rituals, witnessed the rise and fall of leaders, observed mates bond and falter, yet none had ever encountered a force like this, a presence that radiated authority and power in a way that seemed to bend the very rules of their understanding. One elder raised a hand, ancient fingers trembling slightly as they pointed toward her, and the scroll of prophecy that had long rested hidden among sacred texts was unfurled with a reverence born of fear and certainty. Words carved in ink that had survived centuries shimmered faintly in the filtered light, reflecting not just history, but inevitability. "She is the Prophesied Luna," the elder whispered, voice low, but carrying weight that rippled through the pack like the tremor of distant thunder. The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore, impossible to question, and every wolf present felt them resonate deep within their instincts. She had always been destined, always been marked, always been meant for this, but only now had the world been forced to recognize the truth. The Alpha's eyes widened, disbelief carving lines into the pride he had worn so naturally for years. The understanding struck him like ice and fire simultaneously, burning his ego while freezing his certainty in place. He opened his mouth, instinctively attempting to reclaim some fragment of authority, some fragment of the connection he had severed so carelessly, but no words came. His voice, which had always carried power, command, and influence, faltered, caught in the invisible chains of awe, fear, and unacknowledged regret. Her gaze swept over him, cool and unyielding, eyes gleaming with the quiet force of someone who had endured, transformed, and claimed what had always been hers. She did not speak. She did not move forward. She did not acknowledge his presence beyond the subtle, undeniable recognition that he existed at all. And in that silence, the weight of her awakening pressed down on him, heavier than any challenge he had faced, more absolute than any confrontation, more undeniable than any assertion of dominance. The world had shifted, and he was forced to confront a truth that was no longer negotiable, no longer subject to his control, no longer defined by his desires or pride. The pack, sensing the tension, shifted uneasily, instinctively aware that something monumental had occurred. Wolves who had once scoffed at her presence, who had whispered behind her back, who had underestimated her entirely, now lowered their heads, tails brushing the ground in instinctive acknowledgement of a force far beyond their comprehension. Even the rival female, who had once smiled at her humiliation, now shrank back, uncertainty and fear replacing the confidence she had assumed. There was no defiance left in the room, only recognition, quiet, unspoken, and utterly unavoidable, that she had claimed a place none had thought possible, a destiny none could deny. The Alpha's chest tightened with a mixture of jealousy, fear, and awe, his heartbeat echoing in his ears as he realized that every word of rejection, every act of cruelty, every moment he had assumed superiority had only fueled her ascent. And now she stood before them, not pleading, not seeking approval, not offering herself to be claimed, but embodying the truth that had been denied him for too long. She was the Prophesied Luna, and she answered to no one but herself. His lips parted, faltering once more, the need to speak clashing with the overwhelming force of presence before him, and yet she turned her gaze away, deliberately, elegantly, refusing to grant him the recognition he had craved, refusing to allow his voice to tether her power, refusing to remind him that he had ever believed he could control what was never his to command. The silence that followed was deafening, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the skin, and every wolf, every elder, every shadow of the forest acknowledged without question the truth that had arrived in her very step, her very posture, her very being. She did not need to say a word. She did not need to prove herself with action. She simply existed, radiating the certainty, authority, and inevitability of a destiny that no pack, no alpha, no rival, and no past humiliation could ever erase. And in that undeniable presence, the Alpha understood, with a clarity that burned and froze him at once, that she had transcended everything he had believed about her, about himself, and about the world they thought they had known. She had returned, not as the girl he had dismissed in public, but as a force far greater than any of them could have imagined, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Alpha's voice shattered the tense silence of the clearing, rough with desperation, trembling with a vulnerability he had never permitted himself to display in front of the pack. Every syllable he forced from his throat carried the weight of years of arrogance crumbling, of pride torn apart by the undeniable truth standing before him. "I was wrong," he said, the words strange and heavy on his tongue, as if admitting fault was a physical burden he had never known before. The pack around them held their collective breath, sensing the seismic shift, feeling the tremors of power and emotion collide, uncertain whether they should be awed, horrified, or scandalized at this rare and public unraveling of their Alpha's pride. He took a step forward, then another, careful yet unsteady, trying to bridge the distance between them, trying to reach her presence, her authority, her power that had grown too immense to ignore. I rejected you. I humiliated you in front of everyone, and I see now what I cannot take back." His eyes searched hers, desperate for any sign of acknowledgement, any flicker of softened judgment, any hint that the bond they had once shared could still be mended. And yet she did not move, did not blink faster, did not betray a single whisper of internal conflict, remaining statuesque, regal, untouchable, radiating an authority that left him off balance, unmoored from the certainty he had always relied upon. The words poured out, clumsy yet sincere, each one an attempt to reclaim some fragment of what he had destroyed, each one a confession that stripped him bare before the pack and before her. "I was blind. I let my pride rule me, let my arrogance cloud what I should have seen long ago. You are everything I denied myself, everything I did not deserve, everything I cannot live without." His hands, once steady and commanding, shook imperceptibly, a subtle quiver betraying the raw vulnerability that now defined him. The Alpha, the ruler, the master of fear and loyalty, had become a man undone by his own misjudgment, pleading not for dominance, not for authority, not for control, but for forgiveness he did not deserve. The pack remained silent, every wolf instinctively aware of the shift, their ears twitching, eyes fixed, breaths held, sensing the tension between raw vulnerability and unassailable power. Every eye tracked her, waiting, anticipating her response, knowing that the decision she made in this suspended moment would ripple through their lives, reshape alliances, and alter destinies. They had all witnessed humiliation, had seen pride wounded, but nothing had prepared them for the sight of an Alpha reduced to begging at the feet of the one he had scorned, the one whose return had shattered all assumptions, the one who now embodied the culmination of prophecy and untamed potential. And she stood motionless, letting the silence stretch like an endless expanse, allowing every word he uttered to wash over her, to echo against the scars of rejection, to weigh against the knowledge of the power she now wielded. Every fiber of her being resonated with the energy of transformation, with the calm certainty of someone who had survived betrayal, humiliation, and abandonment, emerging on the other side not weakened but indomitable. She did not rush to forgive, she did not bend to his pleading, she did not offer solace or reassurance. Every second she remained silent amplified the gravity of his mistake, the depth of his loss, the futility of the arrogance that had once made him so sure. His eyes never left hers, wide, desperate, haunted, and his chest heaved as he swallowed the shame he had long ignored, the regret that had festered in secret, now laid bare for the entire pack to witness. I cannot ask you to return to me if you do not wish it, but I am yours in every way if you will have me. I was wrong, and I will spend every breath proving that I see you, that I honor you, that I recognize what I should have cherished from the very beginning." Every word was laced with raw need, with pleading, with the realization that power, rank, and dominance meant nothing against the truth of the bond he had shattered, and that her forgiveness, or refusal, would determine the course of all that followed. And the pack watched, the forest listened, the wind stilled, and the world itself seemed to wait, holding its breath as the girl they had once dismissed, the one he had cruelly rejected, prepared to make a decision that would define not only the Alpha's fate but the destiny of all who surrounded them. Should she forgive him, or should she let him feel the full measure of his own folly? The air hung heavier now than ever, thick with anticipation, Every nerve in the clearing taut as though the very earth itself awaited her words. The Alpha's chest heaved, his pride shattered, his vulnerability laid bare before the pack and before the woman whose power had grown far beyond the boundaries of his comprehension. Every eye was fixed on her, every instinct braced for mercy, for reconciliation, for the fragile hope that he might yet reclaim what he had lost. And then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her gaze, allowing her eyes to meet his, not with warmth, not with regret, not with hesitation, but with a quiet authority so absolute it stole the breath from every being present. Her voice, when it came, was calm, unwavering, and carried the weight of inevitability, echoing across the clearing like the distant toll of a bell signaling the end of an era. "The bond you destroyed, it is gone," she said, each word precise, deliberate, carrying both finality and clarity, resonating in a way that left no room for argument or supplication. "It cannot be mended. It cannot be reclaimed. Your rejection was not a mistake to correct, but a threshold I was meant to cross alone." The Alpha's mouth opened, perhaps to protest, to plead, to grasp at any fragment of hope. But the words faltered, swallowed by the gravity of her declaration, the unassailable truth of her transformed existence. Around them, the pack shifted uneasily, instinctively sensing that the rules had changed, that the hierarchy had been rewritten not by force, not by combat, not by challenge, but by destiny itself, by the one they had underestimated for so long, by the one whose presence now defined the very fabric of authority within the territory. She paused, letting the weight of her revelation settle, letting the silence stretch and thrum with unspoken power. And then, as though to seal the finality of what she had become, her lips curved ever so slightly, not in triumph, not in mockery, but in a calm, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that her path was no longer entwined with the Alpha who had once scorned her. "I have accepted another destiny," she continued, her voice firm, resonating with certainty that made the forest itself seem to lean in closer, as if the trees and winds themselves recognized the truth she carried. "A path that does not belong to you, nor to the past we shared. What you lost cannot be returned, because what I have become was never yours to claim." A stir rippled through the pack, some wolves stepping back, some bowing instinctively in recognition, every one of them sensing the magnitude of the shift, the finality of the decision, the impossibility of revering the current of destiny that had been set in motion. The Alpha's chest tightened, a storm of desire, regret, and disbelief clawing at him, leaving him stranded between what he had lost and what he had no longer the power to influence. He realized, with a sharp pang that echoed through his soul, that the woman who had returned so transformed, so powerful, so utterly sovereign, was no longer tethered to him in any way. She had claimed herself, her future, and the bonds that truly mattered were no longer his to touch. And then, just as the tension threatened to break, a shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, a presence unfamiliar, yet magnetic, a figure whose energy resonated with hers in ways that pulled even the Alpha's instincts into confusion. Eyes glimmered in the half-light, and a low, deep growl, filled with respect, recognition, and something unspoken yet unmistakably intimate, echoed through the territory. She did not flinch, she did not falter, she only turned slightly toward the newcomer, acknowledging the arrival of someone who was not a rival, not a threat, but perhaps the mate the prophecy had truly meant her to find. The Alpha's world trembled around him. He had expected pleading. He had hoped for sorrow, for regret, for reconciliation. Instead, he was met with absolute power, absolute clarity, and the quiet, undeniable truth that she had stepped into a destiny far beyond his reach. Every heartbeat, every breath. Every instinct told him he was too late. Every glance she cast in the direction of the new presence reinforced the irrevocable reality that the girl he had once humiliated had chosen her own path, a path that no amount of desire, regret, or dominance could alter. And in that moment, as the forest held its collective silence, the Alpha understood fully, painfully, that she had become something far greater than anyone had anticipated, and that everything he thought he had claimed, everything he believed he controlled, had shifted irrevocably into the hands of a destiny that would no longer answer to him. The bond was broken forever, and she was gone from his world, Not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but because she had become the force she was always meant to be, and her loyalty, her power, and her heart now belonged entirely to a new, unfolding truth. The clearing was filled with tension so thick it could be cut, every wolf sensing the end of one story and the birth of another, the finality of rejection, and the impossibility of reclaiming what had never truly been theirs. And as the new presence stepped fully into view, her eyes met theirs, calm, commanding, radiant with authority, signaling not just a shift of power, but the dawn of a destiny the Alpha could no longer touch, a fate that had always been beyond him, and a future that would never, ever be the same. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every leaf suspended in stillness, every shadow sharpened by the faintest light of the waning sun, as if nature itself recognized that what had transpired was no longer a simple tale of rejection or desire, but the culmination of forces far older, far greater than any wolf could truly comprehend. The Alpha stood frozen, chest heaving, eyes wide with disbelief, mind racing through every memory of scorn, every moment he had allowed pride to blind him, every heartbeat he had assumed belonged to him alone. Around him, the pack shifted uneasily, instinctively sensing the seismic shift that had occurred, feeling the weight of her presence, the undeniable certainty that what they witnessed was not merely a reunion or confrontation, but the beginning of a narrative far beyond their understanding. She moved with a grace that seemed to bend the very air around her, every step purposeful, every glance deliberate, radiating the authority and calm of someone who had endured the fire of humiliation and emerged unbreakable, unyielding, untethered to the past that had once sought to define her. Her eyes, once soft with uncertainty, now burned with the quiet, unwavering light of sovereignty, reflecting not just her own awakening, but the acknowledgement of a destiny that had always been hers to claim. Nothing he could say, nothing he could plead, nothing he could offer would alter the course of what had begun in the silence of her triumph. The bond he had tried to reclaim, the dominance he had once wielded without question, the pride he had clung to so desperately, all of it had been rendered meaningless in the presence of a power that acknowledged no master, no rival, no previous ties of obligation. The wind stirred faintly, carrying with it whispers of prophecy, of untapped strength, of stories yet to unfold beyond the confines of pride and desire. And the forest seemed to pulse with anticipation as the Alpha realized, with a sudden, devastating clarity, that he had not just lost a mate, he had lost the narrative itself. Every instinct screamed, every memory pressed upon him, yet he was paralyzed by the inevitability of her choice, the precision of her awakening, and the unshakable reality that her story, her journey, her power, her essence, was no longer about him, no longer about reconciliation, no longer about the bonds he had assumed he could command. And in that moment, as the pack held its collective gaze upon her, sensing the energy that radiated far beyond their comprehension, she lifted her head, eyes sweeping over the clearing with a calm that was both terrifying and magnificent, and the forest seemed to acknowledge her as it would a force of nature itself, bending to her presence, whispering in secret tongues that the balance had shifted, that history had begun a new chapter, and that everything the Alpha had ever known about control, loyalty, and destiny was now obsolete. She did not speak. She did not need to. The finality of her existence in that moment, the weight of her transformation, and the undeniable power she had claimed was enough to echo through every consciousness present, leaving the Alpha stripped of certainty, stripped of hope, and stripped of the illusion that he had ever dictated the course of her life. And then, with the faintest glimmer of a smile, one that carried no warmth for him, only the promise of what was to come, she turned her gaze toward horizons he could not reach, toward paths he could not follow, and toward a destiny that belonged entirely to her alone. The Alpha's heart sank in recognition, his chest tightening with the bitter knowledge that he was no longer the center of her story, that every plan he had, every thought of reclaiming her, every shred of control he had assumed he wielded, had evaporated into the air that now trembled with her presence. The pack remained silent, the tension so thick it could have been carved with a blade, every wolf sensing the shift, instinctively aware that the tale had grown far beyond the Alpha's grasp, far beyond their assumptions, far beyond the bonds that had once defined loyalty and desire. And in the quiet, stretching seconds before the world resumed its motion, the narrator's voice carried the final truth: impossible to ignore, impossible to counter, and impossible to forget. But what the Alpha didn't know was that her story wasn't about love anymore. It was about power.